It was a time of great ambition. The world was gripped by an age of heroic exploration. In the early 20th century, the final unclaimed prize on Earth was the Antarctic continent. Sir Ernest Shackleton, a veteran of earlier polar expeditions, dreamed of a monumental achievement. He would not simply reach the South Pole, which had already been conquered. His vision was far grander, far more audacious. He planned to lead the first ever trans-Antarctic crossing, a grueling journey of nearly 1,800 miles on foot, from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, right across the heart of the frozen continent. This was the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, a name that captured the soaring spirit of the British Empire at its height. The journey began in August 1914, on the very eve of the First World War. As other men prepared for the battlefields of Europe, Shackleton and his crew of 27 hand-picked men set sail from Plymouth, England. Their vessel was a magnificent ship, aptly named the Endurance. It was a three-masted barquentine built in Norway from the strongest oak and fir, her hull specifically designed to withstand the immense pressures of polar ice. The crew were not just sailors, they were a collection of specialists. There were scientists, a photographer, a surgeon, and hardened seamen, each chosen by Shackleton not just for their skills, but for their character and optimistic spirit. Their destination was the distant, icy shore of the Weddell Sea, a place few had ever seen. The challenge they faced was almost beyond comprehension in our modern world. They sailed without the marvels of contemporary technology that we now take for granted. There was no global positioning system to pinpoint their location with unerring accuracy. Navigation relied on the skill of the captain, Frank Worsley, using a sextant and a chronometer to read the sun and stars. Their clothing was made of wool, gabardine, and fur, a far cry from the lightweight, high-performance thermal gear of today. Communication with the outside world was impossible once they left the last outposts of civilization. They were utterly alone, a tiny speck of humanity venturing into a vast, silent, and unforgiving wilderness of ice and snow. Their ultimate goal was to prove the endurance of the human spirit. Shackleton, known to his men simply as the Boss, understood the psychological toll such a journey would take. He knew that success depended not just on physical strength, but on unwavering morale and absolute trust in his leadership. As the Endurance cut through the waves of the Atlantic, heading south towards the bottom of the world, a sense of great adventure filled the air. The men were eager, optimistic, and ready to carve their names into history. They were embarking on what they believed would be the last great polar journey, a final chapter in the heroic age of exploration, unaware of the incredible saga that truly awaited them. After a long voyage across the Atlantic, the Endurance arrived at the remote island of South Georgia in November 1914. This rugged outpost was the last stop before the true Antarctic wilderness. It was a whaling station, a place inhabited by tough, sea-hardened Norwegian whalers who knew the southern ice better than anyone. They had spent their lives hunting in the treacherous waters of the Weddell Sea. When they heard of Shackleton's plan to sail directly into the pack ice during that particular season, they offered solemn, experienced advice. They spoke of an unusually severe winter. The ice, they warned, was thicker and extended much farther north than they had ever seen before. They urged Shackleton to wait. Shackleton, however, was a man driven by a powerful sense of purpose and a tight schedule. He listened to the whalers' warnings with respect, but he had sponsors to answer to and a mission to complete. He believed in his ship, a vessel built for the very purpose of confronting the ice. He trusted his own experience and the skills of his crew. After a month of final preparations, replenishing supplies and taking on over 60 sled dogs, he made the fateful decision to press on. On the 5th of December 1914, the Endurance weighed anchor and sailed out of the harbor at Grytviken, heading south into the unknown expanse of the Weddell Sea, directly towards the dangers the whalers had described. For the first few weeks, the journey went as planned. The ship skillfully navigated through scattered ice floes, the crew growing accustomed to the blinding white landscape and the sharp, clean air of the Antarctic. The photographer, Frank Hurley, captured stunning images of the ship pushing through the ice, a testament to its power and the crew's high spirits. But as they ventured deeper south, the whalers' warnings began to echo with chilling accuracy. The ice became denser, the open leads of water scarcer. The ship was forced to twist and turn, seeking any path forward through a vast frozen maze that was slowly closing in around them. By mid-January 1915, less than 100 miles from their intended landing spot at Weddell Bay, their progress ground to a halt. The Endurance found itself surrounded by a vast, unending field of solid pack ice. The temperature plummeted, freezing the slushy water between the floes and cementing them into a single, immovable mass. The ship was no longer a vessel sailing on the sea. It was a tiny object trapped within a frozen, solid ocean. For days the crew waited, hoping a change in the wind or current would break up the ice and set them free. But the grip of the Antarctic winter only tightened, and the Endurance became a helpless prisoner, held fast in the jaws of the ice. As the days turned into weeks, the initial hope of a quick release faded into the stark reality of their situation. The Endurance was now locked solid in the ice of the Weddell Sea. There was nothing the crew could do but wait for the seasons to change. Shackleton, ever the pragmatist, immediately shifted his focus from exploration to survival. He understood that maintaining discipline and morale was now the most critical task. He ordered the ship's routine to be strictly maintained. Watches were kept, decks were swabbed, and daily duties were assigned to keep the men occupied and prevent the corrosive effects of boredom and despair from setting in. The Antarctic winter descended upon them with an unforgiving finality. The sun, which had circled the horizon for months, sank lower each day until it disappeared completely in May, plunging them into 4 months of perpetual darkness and twilight. The world became a monochrome palette of black sky, white ice, and the ghostly silhouette of their trapped ship. Temperatures dropped to unimaginable levels, often falling below -30 degrees Celsius. The men adapted, converting the ship's interior into a cozy winter station they nicknamed the Ritz. They passed the long, dark hours reading from the ship's extensive library, playing cards, staging theatrical performances, and listening to music on a gramophone. Even in this static, frozen world, scientific work continued. The expedition's scientists diligently collected data, measuring water depth, recording meteorological conditions, and studying the strange marine life that existed beneath the ice. The photographer, Frank Hurley, experimented with his craft, capturing hauntingly beautiful images of the ship encased in ice under the ethereal glow of the moon and the aurora australis. These activities were not just for scientific record, they were a vital part of Shackleton's strategy. They gave the men a sense of purpose, a feeling that their expedition was not a failure, but had simply entered a new, unforeseen phase. It was a fight against the mental strain of isolation and uncertainty. Throughout this period, the ship and the ice it was trapped in were not stationary. They were part of a massive, slowly drifting ice pack, carried by the silent, powerful currents of the Weddell Sea. Captain Worsley continued his navigational duties, taking readings whenever a star was visible, calculating their position as they drifted hundreds of miles away from where they had first become stuck. The men could feel the immense power of the ice around them. They heard the groaning and screeching of the floes as they ground against each other, a constant, unnerving reminder of the colossal natural forces that held them captive. Their survival now depended entirely on the strength of their ship and the resilience of their spirits. The relative stability of the long winter drift came to a violent end as spring approached in late 1915. The changing seasons and shifting winds began to exert unimaginable pressure on the ice pack. The massive floes, which had been locked together for months, started to move, buckle, and collide. The groaning sounds the crew had grown accustomed to escalated into deafening roars, like artillery fire or thunder. The ice was no longer a solid platform. It was a dynamic, terrifying force of destruction. Huge pressure ridges, walls of broken ice would rise up around the ship, threatening to crush it from all sides. The men watched in awe and terror as the forces of nature waged war on their vessel. The Endurance fought bravely. Her strong oak hull was designed to rise up when squeezed, but the pressure was relentless and came from multiple directions. The ship's timbers began to shriek and crack under the strain. The men worked desperately to protect her, chipping away at the ice and trying to relieve the pressure points, but their efforts were futile against the power of an entire frozen sea in motion. On the 24th of October, a massive pressure wave gripped the ship, lifting her stern and twisting the hull with a sickening crunch. Water began to pour into the hold. The ship's pumps were worked constantly, but they could not keep up with the ingress of icy seawater. Shackleton watched the struggle with a heavy heart. He saw the sternpost being ripped away and the keel buckling. He knew the battle was lost. The ship that had been their home and their hope for over 10 months was dying. On the 27th of October, 1915, he gave the order that every man had dreaded abandoned ship. It was a moment of profound defeat, yet also one of grim necessity. The crew worked with disciplined urgency, transferring essential supplies, sled dogs, and the 3 small lifeboats from the crippled vessel onto the unstable surface of the ice. They had to salvage everything they would need to survive in the most hostile environment on Earth. They established a makeshift camp, which they named Dump Camp, a short distance from the wreck. From there, they watched the final, agonizing moments of their beloved ship. For several more weeks, the Endurance remained afloat, grotesquely twisted and broken, held up by the very ice that had destroyed her. The men could hear the continuous sound of her timbers snapping. Then, on the 21st of November, she finally slipped beneath the surface. Frank Worsley wrote in his diary, "She's gone, boys." The last link to the outside world had vanished, leaving 28 men stranded on a drifting sheet of ice in the middle of the Weddell Sea, thousands of miles from any form of civilization. With the Endurance gone, the men's world, well, it just shrank to the confines of the ice floe they stood upon. Their survival now depended on 3 small, open lifeboats and whatever supplies they had managed to salvage. Shackleton's immediate plan was to march across the ice, dragging the heavy boats towards land, which he calculated to be over 300 miles away. They began the arduous task of hauling the boats, each weighing over a ton, across a treacherous surface of broken ice and deep, soft snow. The work was exhausting and, honestly, pretty demoralizing. After several days of backbreaking labor, Captain Worsley's calculations revealed a devastating truth. They had advanced only a few miles, while the drift of the ice had actually carried them further away from their destination. Realizing the futility of this effort, Shackleton made a difficult decision. They would stop the march and establish a new, more permanent camp on a large, sturdy-looking ice floe. They named this new home Patience Camp, a name that really reflected their new reality. Their lives were now governed by the slow, relentless drift of the ice pack. They could do nothing but wait and hope that the current would carry them north, towards the open sea. This period of waiting was one of the most challenging tests of their resolve. They were castaways on a frozen raft, with no control over their direction or their fate, living under the constant threat of the ice breaking up beneath them. Daily life at Patience Camp was a monotonous routine of survival. The primary concern was food. Their salvaged supplies were precious and strictly rationed. To supplement their meager diet, the men became hunters. They stalked the seals that occasionally appeared on the ice floes and hunted penguins for meat and blubber. The blubber was an essential source of fuel, used for cooking and melting snow for drinking water. Every part of the animal was used. Nothing was wasted. This constant search for food was a grim necessity, a daily reminder of how precarious their existence truly was. The once optimistic explorers were now reduced to the basic primal struggle for sustenance. As they drifted, the psychological strain grew immense. The men lived in flimsy tents, enduring biting winds and the ever-present dampness from melting snow. Yet, under Shackleton's unwavering leadership, discipline never broke down. He ensured that routines were maintained and that every man had a job to do. He encouraged singing, storytelling, and celebrating birthdays to keep spirits high. He moved among the tents, talking to each man, sensing their moods and quelling any signs of dissent or despair. He understood that the survival of the group depended on their unity and their shared belief that the boss would somehow see them through this impossible situation. After 5 months adrift at Patience Camp, the moment the men had been waiting and dreading for finally arrived. In April 1916, as they drifted further north, the vast ice floe that had been their home began to break apart. The warming weather and the ocean swell of the open sea were shattering their frozen raft. The cracking of the ice was a constant, terrifying sound, and deep channels of black water opened up around them without warning. One night, the ice split directly beneath a tent, plunging one of the men into the freezing water. He was rescued just in time, but the incident was a stark signal. Their platform was disintegrating. It was time to take to the boats. On April 9, 1916, after 497 days on the ice, the 28 men launched their 3 small lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, into the treacherous, ice-choked waters of the Antarctic Ocean. Their target was the nearest solid ground they could hope to reach, the remote and desolate Elephant Island, over 100 miles away. The journey was a week-long nightmare. The men were crammed into the small, open boats, exposed to freezing spray, biting winds, and relentless snow squalls. They suffered from debilitating seasickness, frostbite, and thirst, as their fresh water supply was critically low. Navigating through the maze of shifting icebergs and growlers was a harrowing task for the boat commanders, especially Captain Worsley aboard the James Caird. They rowed and sailed through perilous seas, often losing sight of each other in the poor visibility. At night, they would tie the boats together and try to rest, huddling together for warmth as ice formed on their clothing and beards. They were constantly wet, cold, and exhausted. The physical and mental toll was immense. They were fighting for their lives with every pull of the oar, their hopes pinned on the faint outline of an island they had never seen. After 7 days of unimaginable hardship, they finally sighted land. Through the mist and spray, they saw the dark, forbidding cliffs and glaciers of Elephant Island. It was the first solid ground any of them had set foot on in nearly a year and a half. With their last reserves of strength, they navigated through the crashing surf and landed on a small, rocky beach. Some men were so weak and overwhelmed with relief that they collapsed at the water's edge. They had survived the ordeal of the crumbling ice and the perilous boat journey. They were safe from the sea, but their ordeal was far from over. They were stranded on an uninhabited, storm-lashed island, far from any shipping lanes, with no hope of a chance rescue. Reaching Elephant Island was a monumental victory, but Shackleton knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The island was a desolate, inhospitable rock, constantly battered by Antarctic gales. It offered shelter, but no long-term hope. No rescue ship would ever venture into these dangerous, uncharted waters. To stay there meant a slow death from starvation and exposure once their seal meat ran out. Shackleton knew that if his men were to be saved, he would have to go and get help. He announced his most audacious plan yet. He would take one of the small boats and attempt to sail 800 nautical miles across the most violent stretch of ocean on the planet, the Drake Passage, to the whaling stations of South Georgia. The best of the 3 lifeboats, the 22.5-foot James Caird, was chosen for the impossible journey. The ship's carpenter, Harry McNish, worked miracles to prepare the small vessel. Using wood from packing crates and runners from the sledges, he built up the boat's sides to give it a higher freeboard against the monstrous waves. He fashioned a makeshift canvas deck, sealing it with oil paint and seal blood to try and keep the water out. It was a desperate, improvised effort to turn an open boat into something that could withstand the fury of the Southern Ocean. Shackleton selected a crew of 5 men to accompany him: Captain Frank Worsley as navigator, the powerful Tom Crean, and 3 other strong seamen. On April 24, 1916, just 9 days after arriving on Elephant Island, the James Caird was launched into the tumultuous sea. The 22 men left behind under the command of Frank Wild watched as the tiny boat disappeared into the gray horizon. Their own survival now depended entirely on the success of this near-suicidal mission. The journey that followed is now legendary in the annals of maritime history. For 17 days, the 6 men battled hurricane-force winds and mountainous waves, some estimated to be 60 feet high. The boat was constantly under assault, coated in a heavy layer of freezing spray that threatened to capsize it. The men had to crawl out onto the icy deck to chip it away. They were perpetually soaked, bitterly cold, and cramped in a tiny space filled with ballast stones and supplies. They had almost no fresh water and their sleeping bags were frozen solid. Navigating was a supreme challenge. Worsley had to take his sightings of the sun through fleeting gaps in the storm clouds, his hands numb with cold, while his crewmates held him steady. A single navigational error would mean they would miss South Georgia and be lost forever in the vastness of the Atlantic. Against all odds, after a journey of unimaginable suffering and brilliant seamanship, they sighted the dark, mountainous coast of South Georgia. They had made it across the ocean. Although Shackleton and his 5 companions had reached South Georgia, their ordeal was not yet over. They had landed on the remote, uninhabited southern coast of the island. The whaling stations and the help they represented were on the opposite side, 22 miles away, as the crow flies. The sea was still too rough to risk another boat journey around the treacherous coastline. The only option remaining was to cross the island's interior, a forbidding landscape of unmapped glacier-covered mountains and deep crevasses that no human had ever successfully traversed before. It was one final, desperate barrier between them and the salvation of their men. 3 of the men were too weak from the boat journey to attempt the trek. Shackleton chose to go on with his 2 strongest companions, Captain Worsley and Tom Crean. They were poorly equipped for mountaineering, wearing worn-out clothes and boots with screws pushed through the soles for grip. They carried a length of rope, a small stove, and a carpenter's adze to use as an ice axe. On the 19th of May, leaving the other 3 men in the care of a cave, the trio set off into the icy wilderness. They climbed thousands of feet into the freezing mountains, navigating by moonlight and instinct, unsure of what lay ahead. The journey was a 36-hour, non-stop marathon of extreme endurance. They faced sheer ice slopes, navigated around gaping crevasses, and battled freezing fog that threatened to disorient them completely. At one point, lost in the fog on a high ridge and with darkness falling, Shackleton made a risky decision. To save time and avoid freezing to death, they would have to slide down a steep, unknown snow slope. Coiling their rope, they sat down together and launched themselves into the abyss, tobogganing for hundreds of feet into the darkness below. Miraculously, they landed safely in a snowbank, their gamble having paid off. After more than a day of continuous, exhausting trekking, weak with hunger and fatigue, they heard a sound drift up on the wind. It was the sound of a steam whistle from the Stromness whaling station, signaling the start of the working day. It was the first sound of civilization they had heard in nearly 2 years. Spurred on by this sign of hope, they staggered down the final slopes. When they walked into the whaling station, they were a terrifying sight. Their faces were black with blubber smoke, their hair was long and matted, and their clothes were in rags. The station manager who greeted them did not recognize these wild-looking men as the proud explorers who had departed from that same island so long ago. Upon reaching the Stromness whaling station, Shackleton's first act was not to rest, but to arrange the rescue of his men. A whaling boat was immediately sent to pick up the 3 men left on the other side of South Georgia. His next, more difficult task was to rescue the 22 men stranded on Elephant Island. This would prove to be an agonizing challenge. The Antarctic winter had now set in, and a formidable barrier of pack ice surrounded the island. Shackleton made 3 separate attempts to reach his men using borrowed ships, but each time he was defeated by the impenetrable ice, forced to turn back just miles from his goal. The men on Elephant Island, led by Frank Wild, were enduring their own trial. They lived under 2 overturned boats, surviving on a diet of penguins and seals, their hope dwindling with each passing day. Wild maintained a strict routine and an air of determined optimism, refusing to let the men give up. He kept a packed bag ready and a daily watch for Shackleton's return. After 4 long months of waiting, just as their food supplies were nearly exhausted, their vigil was rewarded. On August 30th, 1916, a ship appeared through the mist. It was the Yelcho, a small Chilean steamer that Shackleton had managed to secure. Shackleton stood on the bow, shouting to his men, "Are you all well?" Wild shouted back, "All safe, all well, boss." Incredibly, not a single man from the Endurance expedition was lost. Every one of the 28 men who had sailed from South Georgia almost 2 years earlier had survived the shipwreck, the ice drift, the boat journey, and the long wait for rescue. It was an unparalleled feat of survival, made possible by the indomitable leadership of Ernest Shackleton. His constant optimism, his focus on morale, and his willingness to put his men's welfare above all else created a bond of unity and trust that saw them through every impossible challenge. The story became a testament to the power of teamwork, perseverance, and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. For over a century, the final resting place of their ship remained a mystery. But in March 2022, an expedition announced a stunning discovery. They had found the wreck of the Endurance, sitting upright and remarkably preserved in the frigid, clear waters of the Weddell Sea, nearly 10,000 feet below the surface. The discovery brought the epic saga full circle. While Shackleton's goal of crossing Antarctica was never achieved, his expedition became something far more profound. It is remembered not for its intended triumph, but for its magnificent failure, a timeless and inspiring story of leadership and the unyielding resilience of the human spirit against the harshest forces of the natural world.